At 90 years old, the woman who once dressed Grace Kelly each morning, the silent witness of her royal life, finally breaks her vow of silence. In an interview recorded inside a small apartment overlooking the harbor of Nice, she whispers, "The palace was beautiful. Yes, but it was also the loneliest place on earth." For decades, the world believed in the fairy tale. The Hollywood goddess who married a prince and became the image of perfection, a real-life Cinderella crowned beneath Mediterranean light. Every magazine called her lucky. Every woman envied her. Every photograph looked like happiness carved in marble. But behind those balcony waves and flawless Dior gowns, another story was unfolding, one made not of diamonds, but of locked doors, rehearsed smiles, and a heart quietly dying for freedom. The maid, her voice trembling with age, reveals what the world refused to see. She never wanted to be a queen. She only wanted to go home. The revelation shakes the myth that built Monaco, because Grace Kelly, the American actress who had everything, may have traded not just her career, but her very self for a crown that glimmered like gold and weighed like iron. Inside the palace walls, silence was not peace, it was control. Letters unsent. Scripts returned unopened. A woman once adored for her voice, condemned to speak only through gestures. The girl who once defied Alfred Hitchcock's cameras now bowed to the cameras of the state. And then came the crash, the event that ended a life but began a legend. Yet, what if the real tragedy didn't happen on the winding road to Monte Carlo, but years before? In the corridors of a palace where freedom vanished behind etiquette and mirrors? This is the untold story of Grace Kelly, the queen who never came home. The truth that her maid carried for 60 years will now reopen the doors of the palace, one whisper at a time. She appeared to the world like a dream, sculpted in sunlight. Grace Patricia Kelly, Hollywood's own invention of purity and class. Before the crown, before the palace, she was a girl who carried herself like silence in motion. Cameras adored her restraint, her poise, her careful distance from the chaos of fame. On screen, she never shouted. She looked instead, and the world listened. Alfred Hitchcock once said, "She was fire under ice." To millions, she was the perfect contradiction, beauty without arrogance, sensuality without scandal, emotion without excess. By the time she met Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1955, Grace Kelly was already an icon of discipline, a woman who made control look divine. Hollywood saw her as untouchable, royalty saw her as a solution. The meeting was arranged for a magazine photo shoot during the Cannes Film Festival. Photographers would later call it destiny. In truth, it was diplomacy. Monaco, a small kingdom struggling for relevance, needed publicity. Grace Kelly, weary of being told where to stand, needed escape. Under the Riviera sun, they shook hands for the cameras, and the cameras decided it was love. Within months, the fairy tale was written, printed, and sold to every continent. The actress who had tamed Hollywood would now tame a throne. The wedding was the century's grandest performance. Dior, Cartier, and MGM all took part. 2 million people lined the streets of Monaco, 30 million more watched on television. The palace doors closed behind her, and the world exhaled in awe. She had everything, said a Vogue editor later. Youth, beauty, power, and the approval of every living eye. Yet perfection has a script, and Grace learned it by heart. Every morning, she greeted servants with warmth measured to the second. Every evening, she dined under chandeliers, smiling at diplomats who praised her elegance as if it were proof of happiness. She spoke softly, never too long. She dressed modestly, never too bright. The new princess was expected to be serenity itself, a human emblem for a country that needed tourists more than truths. Her old friends from Hollywood wrote letters, Ingrid Bergman, Cary Grant, and Hitchcock himself. most went unanswered. A few were returned by palace aides. Marked Her Serene Highness, regrets. The illusion deepened with every headline. Grace of Monaco, the happiest woman in the world. From Hollywood to heaven. The princess who made perfection human. But even paradise has its shadows. In private, the palace corridors were quiet, too quiet. The rules were unspoken yet absolute. The princess could no longer act, no longer travel without escort, no longer walk through the city alone. She could no longer be Grace Kelly, she must only be Her Serene Highness. The camera, once her freedom, became her leash. Every photograph was inspected, every angle debated, every gesture weighed against propriety. She had to live as if the world was still watching, said the maid, even when the world forgot to care. In those first years, she obeyed the illusion completely. She learned to move like a statue that breathes, to wave like a queen even when her fingers trembled, to smile with the precision of a clock striking noon. To outsiders, it was a triumph. To those inside the palace, it was theater. She rehearsed her own life, whispered one attendant, and every performance cost her a little more of herself. At official events, Grace stood beside Rainier Handsome, serious and proud. The world saw devotion, the palace saw protocol. He admired her beauty, but he measured it like a state asset. She admired his resolve, but feared his temper. Their affection existed in photographs, framed and frozen, as if time itself were afraid to move them. She gave birth to 3 children. Newspapers declared the monarchy secure. Behind the nursery doors, she whispered lullabies. In English, the language the palace preferred, she forget. In the evenings, when the children slept, she often stood on the balcony overlooking the sea. The same sea that separated her from everything she had been. Sometimes, the maid said, she would hum a line from high society or To Catch a Thief. She never sang aloud, just hummed, almost inaudibly, like a ghost tracing its old reflection. The illusion was complete. The world adored her composure, the court enforced it. And yet, beneath the layers of silk and duty, the woman who once defined elegance was quietly vanishing. Freedom, she once wrote in an unfinished letter found after her death, is a luxury I wore once. Like a dress that no longer fits. It was the kind of sentence that could have come from one of her films, a line whispered by a heroine just before the tragedy begins. The cameras kept flashing. The fairy tale kept selling. But the woman inside the crown had already begun to fade. The maid's story begins not with gossip, but with silence, the kind that presses against the walls until even breathing feels like trespassing. I served her for 26 years, she said, her voice barely rising above the hum of an old tape recorder. And in all that time, I never once saw her truly at ease. Grace Kelly's palace was beautiful. Yes, but beauty in marble has no heartbeat. Every corridor was polished to reflection, every curtain drawn to perfection. The air smelled faintly of lilies, and yet there was no scent of life. She hated the lilies, the maid whispered. They reminded her of funerals. Each morning, at precisely 7:30, Grace would rise, brush her hair in silence, and glance at the framed photograph of her former life, her parents, her sisters, a snapshot of a Philadelphia garden drenched in sunlight. That was her morning ritual, said the maid. 5 seconds of looking backward before facing another day she hadn't chosen. Letters arrived weekly from America Scripts. Invitations, charity requests, personal notes from Hitchcock, always addressed simply, Dear Grace. None ever reached her hands. The palace intercepted them, for her own peace of mind. They said, when the maid once slipped one through by accident, the princess read it at night under her lamp and whispered, They still think I am a lie. The maid remembered how Grace would rehearse her smiles before public events, standing in front of a full-length mirror, testing expressions the way an actress tests lighting. Sometimes she would stop, drop her hands, and stare at her reflection. "Do you think they know I am acting?" she once asked. The maid had no answer. At the beginning, Prince Rainier tried to love her in his own way, practical, protective, distant. He admired her precision, her discipline, but he never understood her longing for work, her need to express, to create. "This is your stage now," he told her, gesturing to the palace. But to Grace, a stage without lines is not theater, it's confinement. When invitations came from Hollywood offers from directors who still believed she could act again, the prince refused. "A princess cannot pretend," he said. The maid remembered Grace, standing by the window afterward, silent, her hand pressed to the glass. "He means I cannot live," she whispered. She began to keep small secrets, the only rebellion she could afford. A locked drawer with old film stills, a music box that played True Love from High Society, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, now colorless but still fragrant. "When I dusted the drawer," said the maid, she would always smile and say, "Careful. That's where my ghosts sleep." Her children grew Caroline, Albert, Stephanie, and became her lifeline. She adored them with a tenderness that frightened the court. She mothered like someone making up for all the love she could no longer give herself. When Albert fell ill as a child, she refused to leave his bedside. The doctors bowed, the prince frowned. She defied rank for motherhood, the maid recalled. "That was the only time I saw her free." But freedom was short-lived. Each act of affection was measured, each word rehearsed. Court advisors warned her that too much openness might humanize the crown. She would laugh quietly, the maid said. Then she would go silent for hours, as if laughter itself were dangerous. By the mid-1970 seconds, Grace's smile had grown thinner. The photographs still showed perfection, but her eyes seemed elsewhere, always looking beyond the lens. "She often told me," said the maid, "that the camera had betrayed her. Once, it made her immortal. Now, it kept her imprisoned." Her last real friendship within the palace was with the gardener, a widower from Nice who tended her roses. They spoke little, she in English, he in broken French, but sometimes she helped him prune the vines when the guards weren't watching. It was the only time she didn't wear gloves, he told the maid. She wanted to feel the thorns. In the private quarters, Grace began to keep a journal. Small, leather-bound, never left unattended. After her death, the palace sealed it, but the maid remembered fragments. Lines written in neat cursive, each one heavy as prayer. "I live surrounded by mirrors that show everything except who I am. If love is duty, then perhaps I've done my job well. Sometimes I dream of the sea, not as escape, but as a way home." There were moments of warmth, too, her laughter with her children, her passion for charity, her belief that kindness was a form of art. But beneath it all ran an undertone of ache, the sound of a life tuned to someone else's key. The maid remembered one afternoon when the princess returned early from an official visit. The palace was empty, the guards distracted. Grace asked her to open the terrace doors wide. The Mediterranean wind rushed in, wild and salt-scented, scattering papers across the floor. For a few seconds, Grace closed her eyes and raised her arms as if to embrace the chaos. "She looked alive then," said the maid. "Just for a heartbeat." But the heartbeat faded. The next day, the doors were locked again. When the maid grew bold enough to ask, "Do you ever wish you had stayed in Hollywood?" Grace smiled sadly. No, she said. Hollywood was a stage. Monaco is a mirror. Either way, I am not there. As years passed, the palace transformed her into a symbol. The woman disappeared beneath the emblem. Even her handwriting, once fluid and daring, became smaller, more careful, as if afraid to offend the page. Then, near the end, there were the drives long, solitary escapes into the hills, far from the polished gates. She drove herself, fast but not recklessly, the maid said. She liked to chase her own reflection on the car window, the only place she could still move without permission. On one of those drives, the maid believed, something broke a moment too sharp, too brief, to be captured by any story. The crash that followed would take her life and turn her into legend. But to those who knew her, the tragedy began long before the road curved. She didn't die in that car, the maid whispered at last. She died slowly, every time she smiled for a world that would not let her breathe. Years later, long after the palace curtains had been replaced and her portrait rehung in every corridor, the maid returned to the room that once belonged to Grace Kelly. The air still carried her perfume, a faint mix of jasmine and talcum, now dulled by time. Dust had softened the outlines of the furniture, but the silence was the same. She asked me to keep one promise, the maid said, to open the drawer only when I was certain the world had stopped pretending. The drawer was small, carved into the bottom of her writing desk. Its key had hung for years on a thin blue ribbon tied around the maid's wrist. She turned it gently, and the lock gave way with a sigh, as if even the furniture had grown weary of secrecy. Inside lay fragments of a life edited out of history, a half-finished letter, its ink faded, a stack of unopened envelopes, a folded program from high noon, and a sheet of hotel stationery bearing a single line in her hand. Freedom is not leaving, it's remembering who you were before you stayed. The maid paused. It was her handwriting, but the ink had run, as if she had been crying when she wrote it. Among the papers was also a small photograph, Grace at a piano, not in Monaco, but in her Philadelphia home. Her hair loose, her expression unposed. No diamonds, no crown, no audience. Just a woman looking somewhere the camera couldn't follow. For a long moment, the maid sat in silence, staring at that face. The Grace she remembered was always composed, deliberate, made of posture and etiquette. But here was something raw, almost defiant. It was as though the woman had left a clue, a whisper to anyone willing to look beyond the myth. I realized then, she said, that the real Grace never wanted pity or rescue. She wanted to be remembered correctly, not as a fairy tale, but as a woman who paid for perfection with her soul. The palace had guarded its narrative for decades, the love story, the accident, the legacy. Yet the contents of that drawer changed everything. They revealed not a trapped princess, but a lucid mind, quietly documenting her disappearance. In one of the letters never sent she had written to a friend in America, they call it a crown, but it is really a circle. You keep walking it until you forget where the beginning was. Sometimes I miss the noise of a film set, not because of fame, but because people there could make mistakes. Here, even silence must be perfect. The maid folded the paper back carefully. Her hand shook. It felt like she was still speaking, still explaining herself to a world that never listened. And then, beneath the papers, a smaller envelope appeared blank, sealed. No name. The maid hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a thin gold chain, holding a small pendant in the shape of an open door. No jewels, no engraving, just an empty doorway. She must have kept it as a symbol, the maid murmured. The door she could never walk through. After the drawer was emptied, the maid stood by the window. The view of the Mediterranean shimmered, endless and indifferent. I finally understood why she loved the sea, she said. It was the only thing in Monaco that didn't belong to anyone. The revelation wasn't a scandal, it was a confession carved into silence. Grace Kelly had never rebelled publicly, never defied her husband, never spoken against the crown. But she had resisted in the only way she could, by recording the truth of her own fading. Her final days, the maid recalled, were marked by an urgency no one else understood. Grace began writing late at night, tearing pages, rewriting them. She was planning something, said the maid. Not escape, but honesty. 2 weeks before her death, Grace requested the car be serviced. She wanted to drive alone, to visit a small village she loved in the hills. She said she needed to remember the road, the maid whispered, as if the road itself held something sacred. When the crash came, it was reported as an accident. Rain, curves, speed. The official statement was clean, respectful, rehearsed. But the maid, who saw the wreckage later, said softly, the brakes were intact. The weather was clear. Then she added, after a pause heavy with grief, sometimes, when the cage opens, the bird forgets how to fly. In the years since, the palace has maintained its image flowers at the memorial, tributes on anniversaries, glossy documentaries, but none mention the drawer, or the letters, or the pendant. None mention the woman who wrote, "Freedom is remembering who you were." The maid still keeps that pendant on her table. It reminds me, she said, that she found a way to leave not through rebellion or escape, but through truth, even if no one read it until now. The great shock, then, is not that the fairy tale was a lie. It is that it was built by a woman who knew it was, and kept living it anyway out of love, out of duty, out of a promise to protect her children and her country. She wore silence like silk, and the world mistook it for grace. When the maid finished her story, she looked out to the horizon, the sun dissolving into the sea, the same sea Grace had stared at countless nights. People say she became a legend, she murmured. But legends don't breathe. She was just a woman who wanted to go home. The maid's voice fades, but her words linger like perfume in an empty room. Outside, the sea turns silver under the last light calm, endless, untamed. It is the same horizon Grace once watched from her balcony, the only part of Monaco that refused to obey protocol. History will continue to call her Her Serene Highness. But serenity is not peace. It is control, polished until it shines. What the world saw as perfection was, in truth, the stillness of someone who no longer dared to move. Grace Kelly's story is not about glamour. It is about the quiet suffocation of a woman told she had everything until she realized that everything meant she could no longer be herself. The crown did not destroy her, it erased her, inch by inch, behind rituals and duties so graceful they almost looked divine. In the end, she became a symbol of elegance. But what is elegance if not the art of hiding pain beautifully? The maid's revelation does not tarnish the legend. It humanizes it. It reminds us that even fairy tales cast shadows, and that the distance between paradise and prison is sometimes only a smile. Maybe that is the true cost of being adored, to live under a gaze so constant that you forget how to look inward. The drawer, the letters, the pendant, they are not relics of scandal, but evidence of a private rebellion, a proof that behind the silence, there was still a heartbeat, faint but steady. Grace Kelly never escaped Monaco, but through her words, she reclaimed her name. She left not a confession, but a mirror. If we dare to look into it, we might see ourselves the parts we trade for acceptance. the dreams we bury for the illusion of peace. The maid said, in the end, she didn't want to be remembered as a princess. She wanted to be remembered as someone who loved the world enough to make it beautiful, even when it hurt. That is her legacy. Not diamonds or titles. Not perfection sculpted into photographs, but the courage to endure with dignity. To choose silence not out of fear, but as the last form of grace. The sea outside Monaco keeps moving, unguarded, endless. Somewhere within its tide, perhaps, drifts the echo of her final truth that freedom is not in leaving, but in remembering who you were before the world asked you to forget. And with that memory, at last, Grace Kelly, the queen who never came home, finally does.